Welcome to lesson 8, and in this particular lesson we look on how to create simple React form. And without further ado, let's get started. What is a form? A form is a UI element that is used to collect data, to validate data and submit the user data to the backend. The objective of this lesson is to explain how to create a simple form and allow the user to provide some data, and how we can validate that data, and how then we can submit the form data. And therefore, when we want to create a form in React, we use the form tag as this. So in React, the form data is managed within the component's state property and updated using the setState function. So we use the useState hook to keep track of each input value on the form. So in this particular lesson, we will learn on how to use this particular hook in order to be able to manage the form data and update the form data and track the data changes on the form input fields. So without further ado, let's get started and take a practical example on how we can create a simple React form. So I'm going to turn over to my VS Code, and in the app.js component, I'm going to create a form within the return. So I'm going to add a div, and within the div, I'm going to add the form tag to create a simple form. And within the form, I can now be able to add different input fields. So I want to add 3 input fields to allow the user to enter their first name, email, and phone number. So I'm going to add the first input, and within the opening tag of that input field, I'm going to add these attributes. So the first attribute I want to add is the type attribute. The type attribute specifies the type of the input field. So I'm going to say text. The next attribute I want to add is the placeholder, which says e.g. John. And the next attribute I want to add is the name, and each input element must have a unique name. And then I'm also going to add the value. Now in place of value, we need to declare the variables that will hold the values which are entered by the user on the form. So for each of the input, we are going to have a variable that will hold the value of the data entered. So above here, within the main function, I'm going to declare 3 of the useState variables that will hold the 3 values entered. So I'm going to declare the first variable, which is a full name, and then it must also have the set full name, which is the method that will update the value when it changes, and this must be a useState, and by default it will have an empty string. I'm also going to declare the variable that will hold the email. So I'm going to call it email, and it is also going to have associated value method called setEmail, and then I'm going to assign it to a useState, and by default it should have an empty string as well. Next, I'm going to declare this variable that will hold the phone number, and I'm going to call it phone and provide set phone as the update method. And I'm going to also associate it to useState, by default having empty string. Now that I have all the variables that will store the values entered by the user. So when the user enters the first full name, we will store that value in full name. If the user enters email, we will store it in this email variable. When the user enters phone number, we store it in this variable called phone number. And when any value changes, when the user, for example, deletes the phone or provides a different digit in the phone, then this method will be called, and this method will update this variable. Okay, so now within this first input field for the full name, the value should be associated with the full name. So the value should be equal to the full name. And then lastly, I'm going to add on change event. On change event. So on change event will track this input field, and in case of any change, we should be able to call this method called set full name, which will in turn update the value stored in the full name variable. So on the on change event, I'm going to get that event. I represent it as E, or whatever name you may want to use. You can use event. For my case, I'm using E because it makes my code shorter. Then we're going to use an arrow function, and I'm going to say set full name, and I'm setting it to event.target.value. So that's all about the first input field. Then I am going to create the second input field. So let me just add the breaks here so that we can have a better space between the input fields. Now I'm going to add the second one, and this time round it is going to be for the email. So the same thing, I'm going to add these attributes. So the first attribute is the type, and the type I can provide email or text, whatever you want to use. It's better to use email. And then value or placeholder. Placeholder is optional. So for example, e.g. john@gmail.com. And then I'm also going to provide the name attribute and say the name is email. This name is important as it will be used in the backend to track the data once the form is submitted. And then I'm also going to say value, and the value I will attach it to the email variable which we declared right above here. And then I'm also going to add the change event on change, and I'm going to provide the event as E, and then set email once this event occurs. So event.target.value. event.target.value. And then I'm also going to add a line break so that we can have this appear in the next line. Next, I'm going to add the input for the phone number, and here I'm going to provide the type as well, and here I can simply say text, and then I can have the placeholder and say e.g. 07018, something like that. Then I'm also going to have the name attribute, and I can call it phone number to be used in the backend. Then I'm also going to have the value attribute, which should be attached to the variable phone. And lastly, I'm going to add on change event, and I'm going to provide event as E and E, and then I'm going to use the arrow function and set phone to event.target.value. So now we are done with the 3 input fields, and now when I save my form, let me now save the changes, and we'll be able to view this in the browser. You should see that now we have a simple form with 3 input fields. And now you can put your mouse here and put your cursor there and start typing maybe my first name, Osman, and then I can enter the email, and then I can as well enter the phone number. Right, now that we have the form created, after the data has been entered, we need to have a button below it so that we can be able to click on that button and submit the form. Now let's proceed to create the button. So below this, I'm also going to add another second line break. Let me even add 2 line breaks. And right below this, I'm going to create a button. And the button text, I can say submit, or whatever text you want to put as the button text. And now when you save, you should be able to see your button appearing right below that. Let me, yes, it appears down here with the text submit. But now if you click on the button, nothing happens because we have not attached the event handler to the button when clicked. So let's go back and create the event handler, and then we can add on click event, so that within the on click event in this, we need to add now the event handler. So I can go back up here and create a function, or even within this I can say alert, and say form, or say thank you for submitting your application. Let's say you are applying for something. Thank you for submitting your application. Now we are saying once this button is clicked, then throw this message to the user. But in the real sense, you will have more complex event handlers when you click on the button. So now let's go back to our browser. You can see once I click on the event, this happens and the alert box is displayed. Now you can style this form in different ways, so that you can have these spaces, or you can even have this form placed at the center. To do that, you need to apply your CSS. Now, to avoid wasting time, I have copied the code for the CSS of this form. So let me get this CSS code and let's apply it in our CSS file. So I can see I am going to copy this CSS code. And now where do we place our CSS code? So we got, since we are having our JSX code within the app.js, then we need to navigate to app.css. So the app.css is right here, and now here I'm going to place this code for this form. And now you can see I'm having classes. I have the class simple form. So let me take this same class and assign it to the form tag. So I'm going to give it a class name and call it simple form. So once that is saved, and go back to the browser, you can see that now we have a form with the better styles. And when you place it here, you can see it has an outline of green. Each input field, once it gets the focus, it has an input line of green, output line. And now the button is styled even more better with a background and text color. And now you can submit, and you can be able to get this alert box. Now the next thing we want to do is to make sure we validate this data before submission. And you can see right now, even when I'm not entering any value, when I proceed to click the button tells me thank you for submitting your application. But this is not what we want to do. We want to make sure before we click the button, before the data is submitted, it is validated that the input fields are not empty and that the number and the email meets the criteria. So to be able to do that, then we need to go back and create a better event handler. So we can remove this from here, this method from here. We can go back and create a function that will validate the input fields, and then after validation it can now submit the data to the backend, and then it can be able to display the alert box. So I'm going to create a function within here and call it handle submit, and then it's going to be asynchronous, and it's also going to be an arrow function, asynchronous. Inside here I want to be able to validate the form, so I'm going to say if full name is equals to null is equal to empty, or phone number is equal to empty, or email is equals to empty string, then throw an alert box saying please provide all the required information. So now we are validating for empty values, and then else if everything is okay, then you should also throw an alert box saying, so let us remove this alert box from here and put it right in the else part. Now when we come back to the on-click event of the button, we now need to call this method called handle submit. So let me call this method handle submit. So when the button is clicked, this method will be called, and when this method is called, this method will check for these three input fields to see if none of them is empty, and if some is empty, if some of them are empty, then it will display this text saying please enter all the required information, and if all of them have values, then it will submit this and say thank you for submitting your application. Now let's save these changes and try to submit the form without entering any values. So when I click on this, you get this message saying please provide all the required information. Already we have been able to add the validation, a symbol validation. And now when I enter all the values, I may enter some random values here and enter the number. Now when I click submit, it now displays and says thank you for submitting your application. So that is it all about this lesson, and in our upcoming lesson we shall see on how to add more complex validations, such as validating the number of the digits or validating the format of the email, and being able to actually send this data to the backend using the API. Otherwise, that's all about this lesson, and thank you for joining and watching. See you in our next upcoming lesson.